The Vornak had ruled the Galactic Accord for 3,000 years. Not through diplomacy, not through science, but through fear. They were the only known species to have evolved on a Class 9 death world. A brutal, storm-ravaged moon where predators the size of starships hunted beneath twin moons, where acid rain dissolved metal alloys, and where the very atmosphere cycled through toxic surges every 40 hours. Every other member of the Galactic Accord had come from gentle worlds, warm oceans, stable climates, slow evolutionary pressure. The Vornak had been born in a crucible. Fleet Commander Drex Navarre stood on the observation deck of the Gas Dominion, his 7-foot frame draped in ceremonial armor made from the bones of creatures no other species had ever dared face. He looked down at the blue marble that the navigation charts labeled Sol 3, a small, unremarkable planet in a quiet arm of the galaxy. The Accord had been monitoring it for 2 centuries, curious but dismissive. "They've launched another primitive orbital vessel," said Science Officer Keth, her bioluminescent skin flickering with mild amusement. "Combustion-based propulsion. No shields. No weapons. They're barely a Type 1 civilization." Drex Navarre turned slowly. "Send the standard contact package. Trade routes, Accord membership terms, and the usual biological survey request." Keth hesitated. "Commander, their planet. I've been running the atmospheric models. Gravity at 9.8 meters per second squared. 70% ocean with significant tidal activity. Seismic instability across multiple tectonic plates. Average surface temperature range from -89 to +56 degrees Celsius. Significant predatory megafauna." "Keth," he interrupted with practiced boredom. "Every planet has something to inconvenience the locals." "Yes, sir. But their planet's classification came back. It's a Class 8 death world." Silence fell over the bridge like a collapsed star. Drex Navarre turned back to the viewport, staring at the blue marble with new eyes. "Class 8. One step below Draken Prime. The Vornak homeworld. The place where they'd spent millennia bleeding and dying and becoming something terrifying. One step below our home," he said softly. "Yes, Commander. And the biological survey data is unusual. Their dominant species, they call themselves humans, have skeletal structures with redundant bone reinforcement. Their hearts can operate at significantly elevated rates under stress. They have a documented healing factor that outperforms our medical nanites in certain trauma categories. And Commander..." Keth's skin flickered rapidly, a sign of deep unease among her species. "Their historical records indicate they have been engaged in organized, large-scale interspecies warfare for at least 10,000 years. Continuously." Drex Navarre said nothing for a very long time. On the planet below, an ancient human named Ambassador Chinwei was boarding a shuttle that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, carrying a briefcase of diplomatic materials and a thermos of green tea. She had survived a war, 3 political coups, 1 typhoon, and a mugger in Sao Paulo. She was 62 years old and had the posture of someone who had never once considered the concept of backing down. She had been briefed that an alien vessel was in orbit. She had said, "Interesting," and asked if there would be translation assistance. The shuttle launched. The humans were coming up to meet the Vornak. And Drex Navarre, conqueror of 12 systems, veteran of 100 campaigns on the most lethal world in the known galaxy, felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt uncertain. The first meeting took place in a neutral docking bay, a concession Drex Navarre had made almost without realizing it. He had expected something like his own people, large, armored, aggressive, radiating threat. What came through the airlock was a relatively small biped, gray-haired, with eyes the color of deep ocean water. She smiled at him. He had read the briefings on humans smiling. The bared teeth were not aggression. It was friendliness. He reminded himself of that 3 times. "Ambassador Chinwei," she said. "Earth. Sol system. You must be the Vornak." She looked up at him the way he'd seen young Vornak warriors look at a mountain they intended to climb. Not with fear. With assessment. "I am Fleet Commander Drex Navarre of the Galactic Accord," he said through the translator. "Your world has been classified." "Class 8 death world, yes," she said cheerfully. "Our planetary scientists are actually quite proud of that. Though I believe the official designation system doesn't account for the fact that we find it perfectly livable." She tilted her head. "What's your homeworld classified as?" "Class 9, he said, waiting for the awe. She nodded slowly. "So you're 1 step above us. Good. Then you'll understand what I mean when I say we'd very much like to join the Accord. We come in peace and we don't rattle easily." She held out her hand. The gesture, he knew, was called a handshake. A human tradition of grasping the weapon hand to demonstrate it held nothing. He reached out and took her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes didn't waver. Drex Navarre had broken the arms of creatures the size of ground vehicles. He had fought in environments that would kill most Accord species in minutes. He had never once been stared down. This small human diplomat was staring him down, smiling and waiting for an answer. "Welcome to the Galactic Accord, Ambassador," he said. Later, in his private log, he added a single note. *, they are not what we expected. We must learn much more before we understand what we have invited among us. *. On Earth, in a government briefing room smelling of stale sandwiches, the report came back. First contact successful, peaceful, diplomatic status established. Someone asked if the aliens were dangerous. The ambassador's report said, "They have a Class 9 homeworld. They're used to danger. But so are we. We'll get along fine." She was, as it turned out, both completely right and magnificently wrong about how fine things would get. Thessar Station was considered the most dangerous neutral territory in the Galactic Accord, a massive trading hub built into the hollowed core of a dead asteroid, where the laws of 40 species applied simultaneously and the laws of none applied absolutely. It was the kind of place where deals were made that civilizations pretended not to know about, where smugglers rubbed elbows with ambassadors, and where violence was technically prohibited but practically inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Okafor had been posted there for 6 months. He was 31 years old, from Lagos by way of the ESA Academy, and he had the calm, focused energy of someone who had decided long ago that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He commanded a small team of 8 humans, the first human security detachment assigned to a Galactic Accord facility. Most of the station's residents found humans fascinating in a detached, academic way. Some found them alarming. The Vornak contingent, a detail of 12 warriors posted for their own diplomatic purposes, had been pointedly ignoring the human team since arrival. Their commander was a young Vornak named Kethvar, no relation to the science officer, who had made it quietly clear that he considered the human assignment a political novelty. Deathworlders tolerated, not respected. That changed on the 183rd day. The Thessari pirates didn't announce themselves. They never did. One moment Thessar Station was running its ordinary commerce, and the next, 6 armed vessels had hard docked to 3 of the major airlocks simultaneously, and the first teams of Grethkai mercenaries were cutting through bulkheads with plasma torches, moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. The Grethkai were large, quadrupedal, armored in natural chitinous plates, capable of surviving vacuum exposure for short periods and utterly merciless. They had hit 17 stations in the past decade. The Accord response was always the same: negotiate, pay, suffer minimum casualties, mourn. Marcus had a different plan. He had been awake for 19 hours when the alarm sounded. He had 4 hours of sleep in the previous 48. He had a persistent shoulder injury from a training accident, 2 of his 8 team members were in the medical bay with a stomach virus, and his coffee had gone cold. None of that was relevant information. The relevant information was the station schematic on his tablet, the positions of his remaining 6 personnel, and the estimated location and heading of 14 confirmed hostiles moving through the lower commerce ring. Station Control, this is Lieutenant Commander Okafor. Confirm all non-combatant personnel are moving to shelter protocols. He didn't wait for confirmation before he was moving. Team, sound off. 6 voices sounded off. Play. Professional. Kethvar found him in the corridor 60 seconds later, leading his Vornak detail, fully armored, weapons drawn. The Vornak commander looked at the human officer, this average-sized, lightly equipped, clearly sleep-deprived human, and made a rapid calculation. The Grethkai come from a Class 5 world, Kethvar said. They are not soft. You should move your people to the shelter with the civilians. We will handle this. Marcus looked at him. Not with offense. With something that Kethvar would later struggle to describe, it was the look of a person being told something they already knew was wrong and choosing not to argue about it. With respect, Commander, Marcus said, I have responsibility for this station's security. I'm not moving to a shelter. He looked at the schematic. Their approach vectors are going to funnel them through 3 corridors. If we seal the junctions here, here, and here, he pointed, we cut their element separation and force them into a single choke point. We need to move in the next 4 minutes or the geometry stops working for us. Kethvar stared at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then, show me the approach vectors. They moved together. What followed was 47 minutes of close-quarters station combat that the Accord incident report would later describe as unexpectedly decisive. The human team operated with a particular characteristic that the Vornak observers noted in every after-action briefing. They did not stop. Under fire, in the dark, with casualties, in corridors that were partially venting atmosphere and in one case actively on fire, the humans kept moving, kept coordinating, kept pushing. Corporal Yuki Tanaka took a plasma graze across her left arm bad enough to partially cook the muscle beneath, and she switched her weapon to her right hand without breaking stride and kept fighting. Sergeant Emeka Chukwu got 3 ribs broken when a Grethkai threw him into a bulkhead, and he got up, picked up his weapon and said, "Ow," before re-engaging. Marcus himself was struck twice, non-penetrating hits that would leave spectacular bruises, and at no point did he appear to consider stopping as a viable option. The Grethkai were accustomed to opponents who eventually decided that the math didn't add up, that survival instinct would kick in, that there was a point at which rational beings chose to stop absorbing damage. The humans didn't appear to have located that point. 14 Grethkai were captured or incapacitated. None escaped. 3 human team members required medical attention. None died. Kethvar stood in the aftermath, the acrid smell of burned atmosphere and plasma fire still heavy in the recycled air, and looked at Marcus Okafor, who was pressing a bandage to his forearm while simultaneously filing an incident report on his tablet. "You are injured," Kethvar said. "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "You continued fighting while injured." "Yeah." Kethvar was quiet for a moment. Then, on Draken Prime we have a saying. The warrior who does not acknowledge pain is either dead or worthy of great respect. He paused. "You are not dead." Marcus looked up from his tablet. A small smile. "Thanks. I think." "It was a compliment," Kethvar said. And for the first time since the human team had arrived on Thessar Station, the Vornak commander used a tone that was not dismissive. Word traveled through the Accord the way significant things always did, too fast for anyone to control, and wrapped in details that grew more elaborate with each retelling. What was consistent in every version? 6 humans had held a station against 14 Grethkai mercenaries for 47 minutes. What grew in the retelling were the injuries, the odds, the darkness, the fire. What no version ever felt the need to exaggerate was what Kethvar filed in his official report. *The humans did not stop. I do not fully understand why. I recommend further study. I also recommend, respectfully, that the Accord reconsider the assumptions underlying our security assignments. The Vornak had believed they were the only ones who didn't know when to quit. They were learning otherwise. Marith was not a pleasant world by any civilization's standards. Gravity ran at 1.3 times Earth standard, heavy enough to be exhausting, not heavy enough to be immediately lethal. The atmosphere was technically breathable but carried fine particulate iron oxide that stained everything red and required filter masks for long-term exposure. Surface temperature averaged -20 Celsius, dropping to -60 in the long nights. And beneath the rusty surface, veins of a rare mineral called stabalite ran deep, and stabalite powered the Accord's faster-than-light communication networks, so Marith mattered enormously to everyone and was pleasant to no one. 3 species had tried to establish permanent colonies. The Thessari had lasted 11 months before extreme weather events destroyed 2 of their primary domes. The Peluran had managed 8 months before the gravity-related health complications forced evacuation. The Keshmarati had made it 6 months, suffering a casualty rate that their medical teams classified as unsustainable. The humans had been there for 4 years. Dr. Amara Johansson-Osei ran the Marith colony with the energy of someone who had chosen this assignment because she genuinely liked it. She was 44, Swedish-Ghanaian by heritage, planetologist by training, and possessed of the particularly human trait of becoming more cheerful as conditions became more difficult, as though adversity was the preferred operating environment and comfort was slightly boring. The colony had 847 permanent residents when the supply chain failed. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't war. It was bureaucratic collapse, a cascade of Accord administrative failures that meant the resupply ships stopped coming, the replacement parts stopped arriving, and the communication relays went dark. Marith colony was alone, undersupplied, and operating in conditions that had defeated 3 other species in under a year. Amara called a colony-wide meeting. "We have," she said, in the central dome where all 847 residents could crowd together smelling of iron dust and recycled air, "a problem. Supply chains are down. We don't know for how long. What we do know is what we have, what we can make, and what we're capable of. So let's figure it out." What followed over the next 11 months was something that the Accord crisis response teams, when they finally arrived to assess the damage and found the colony not only intact but expanded, would spend considerable time trying to understand. The humans had improvised. The food synthesis systems were running at 60% capacity. Amara's team had identified every native organic compound that human digestive systems could safely process and had developed 12 new food sources, ranging from edible to genuinely not terrible. Protein requirements were supplemented. No one was malnourished. The heating systems were failing progressively. The colony's engineers had developed a heat-sharing protocol using insulated corridors and what one engineer described as the most complicated electric blanket system in human history. Body heat from sleeping colonists was captured, processed, and redistributed. Peak winter nights dropped the central dome to 5 Celsius. No one froze. Medical supplies were critically low. Dr. Johansen Osei, whose primary specialty was planetary geology, had spent 3 months learning emergency medicine from the colony's actual medical team and had instituted a training program that turned 200 colonists into capable field medics. They ran out of anesthetic for minor procedures. They improvised substitutes. They documented everything. The communication systems were dark for most of the period. The colony's 17-year-old engineering prodigy, a girl named Peta Havilai from Auckland, had rebuilt the primary antenna array 3 times using salvaged materials and had eventually gotten a low-bandwidth signal through, not enough for full communication, but enough for a distress ping, which finally triggered the Accord response. When the rescue fleet arrived, the commanding Vornak officer, a veteran named Grath Koval, had expected to find survivors. He expected the hollow eyes of people who had been through ordeal. He expected desperation and relief. What he found was 847 people in good health, thinner than optimal, some showing signs of long-term physical stress, but fundamentally intact, who had built 3 new habitat domes during the crisis, expanded the stabolite extraction operation, and were in the middle of celebrating a birthday. "You built new domes?" Grath Koval said. He was standing in the central dome, looking at the construction reports Amara had handed him. "During the supply crisis. We had people and materials," Amara said. "We needed more space. It seemed practical. You were in survival conditions." "Yes. And you expanded your colony." "It gave people something to work toward," she explained with the tone of someone explaining why you should always carry a spare water bottle. "Purpose is important in difficult situations." The construction teams were the happiest people in the colony. "I'm a planetologist by trade. I know what boredom does to people. Productive work is better." Grath Koval looked at her for a long moment. He was a Vornak, born and raised on a Class 9 death world, veteran of campaigns that would have ended most civilizations. He had been through things that no other species in the Accord would have survived. He was looking at a middle-aged human scientist who had kept 847 people alive, healthy, and productively occupied through 11 months of crisis conditions on one of the least pleasant worlds in the Sigma Expanse. Not because she was a warrior, not because she had special training, but because she was human, and humans apparently did not recognize the option of simply accepting defeat. "Dr. Johansen Osei," he said slowly, "I have a question." "Of course. When did you stop being afraid?" She looked genuinely puzzled. "I beg your pardon?" "Fear. During the crisis. When did it stop?" "Oh." She thought about it. "It didn't really. We were frightened the whole time. We were just too busy to let it stop us." She tilted her head. "Why would we stop? Being afraid doesn't mean you give up. It just means you're paying attention." Grath Koval was very quiet for a long time. In his official report, filed 6 weeks later, he included a passage that would be read and reread in Accord administrative circles for years. The human colony on Marith did not survive by suppressing fear. They survived by carrying it with them and continuing anyway. This may be the most significant distinction between humans and every other species we have encountered. They have not conquered their survival instincts, they have learned to function alongside them. The implications for our understanding of hardiness as a species trait require immediate reassessment. The Vornak had thought that the absence of fear was what made a Deathworlder. They were beginning to understand the truth was far more complicated and far more impressive. The Deep Space Survey vessel HSF Perseverance was, by any objective measurement, a miracle of engineering and a nightmare to live aboard. 90 meters from bow to stern, crew of 32, designed for 18-month deployments in regions of space where no resupply or rescue was feasible. The Accord had nothing like it. Their survey vessels operated in pairs, within range of established relay stations, with strict protocols about exposure duration. The humans had built a ship designed to go farther, stay longer, and come back alone. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto Cruz had commanded the Perseverance for 2 years before the accident. He was quiet, methodical, and possessed of the particular deep space temperament that came from genuinely preferring the silence between stars to the noise of populated worlds. His crew were the same: specialists, researchers, people who had chosen the most isolated posting in human space because they wanted to be out there. The accident was a gravitational anomaly, a rogue dense object that the survey instruments detected 11.4 seconds before impact. Not enough time to do anything except brace. The resulting damage was catastrophic. The primary drive was gone. 2 of the 3 life support redundancies failed simultaneously. The ship's hull had an irregular fracture in the secondary cargo section that was being contained by emergency sealant and would fail completely in an estimated 72 to 96 hours. Power was at 22%. Communications were operating on emergency power at 2% efficiency. Enough to send a distress signal, not enough to get a response, not enough for two-way contact. The nearest Accord vessel was 23 days away. They had life support for, in the best case, 9 days. Chief Engineer Dr. Paloma Reyes had been doing math for 6 hours when she came to the captain with her findings. "Tell me," he said. "At full crew 9 days," she said. "At reduced crew we can stretch it. If we drop to 18 people using supplemental oxygen protocols, we can get to 14 days. If we drop to 10 people..." She hesitated. "How far?" 22 days. Maybe 23. Silence. "The Accord vessel is 23 days out," he said. "Yes." "So 10 people can survive until rescue?" "Yes." "And the other 22? Paloma's hands were very still. Engineers had that quality, the ability to present terrible information without letting it become something other than information. They would need to enter the emergency stasis pods. Stasis uses significantly less oxygen and generates significantly less CO2. The problem is the stasis system was damaged. We have 12 functional pods. Not 32. 10 survive in regular conditions. 12 in stasis, he said. 22 people, she said. Yes. Yamamoto sat with that for a long time. The Accord vessel that received the distress signal, 23 days later to within 6 hours, was a Vornak patrol ship, the Gas Iron Resolve, commanded by Admiral Thresh-Navar, who was the younger sibling of Drex-Navar and who had heard, through family channels, the reports of humans that were beginning to accumulate across the Accord's collective memory. What the Iron Resolve found, drifting in the dark 23 days after the distress signal, was the HSF Perseverance. Hull fracture sealed with what the engineers identified as a combination of emergency sealant, insulation foam, and, upon closer inspection, sections of bulkhead plating that had been manually welded from the inside. Life support running. Power at 8%. 32 people alive. 32, the sensor officer confirmed. All of them. Thresh-Navar pulled up the technical analysis of the Perseverance's current configuration and spent 12 minutes reading it. The chief engineer had restructured the entire power distribution network. She had rerouted systems in ways that the original designers had never intended. The emergency oxygen generation system had been connected to backups it was never designed to interface with. The stasis pods, all 12 functional ones, were running but they were cycling, 4 hours in stasis, 2 hours out, rotating through the entire crew roster, distributing the metabolic burden across everyone rather than concentrating survival in a few. No one had chosen to live while others died. They had collectively, unanimously, chosen a more difficult path that kept everyone in the equation. Captain Yamamoto met the boarding party in the docking bay. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks, which was accurate. He was steady on his feet and his eyes were clear. "Captain Yamamoto," Thresh-Navar said, "your distress signal indicated catastrophic life support failure." "It did at the time," Yamamoto said. "We fixed it." "You fixed it." "Best we could, anyway. I apologize for the state of the ship. Dr. Reyes has opinions about the modifications, mostly that they violate warranty terms." He almost smiled. "She's probably right." Thresh-Navar looked at this man, this quiet, exhausted, upright man who had apparently looked at a choice between letting 22 people die or finding a way to keep all 32 alive, and had simply refused to accept the first option. "How?" Thresh-Navar asked. "How did we fix it?" "How did you choose," Thresh-Navar said carefully, "not to use the stasis pods to save the minimum number?" Yamamoto looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "The pods could cycle," he said. "If they could cycle, everyone could take a turn. If everyone could take a turn, everyone could make it. We had 23 days. He shrugged, a small motion but somehow enormous in context. 23 days is a long time. Long enough to figure it out. Thresh-Navar stared at him. You didn't consider, she said slowly, the possibility of failure? Of course we considered it, Yamamoto said. We considered it constantly. But you do not try something because it might fail. He seemed to recognize this might need elaboration. If you don't try and everyone dies, you know you failed. If you try and everyone survives, you know you succeeded. If you try and it doesn't work. He paused. At least you tried. That matters. To us it matters. In the medical bay, treating mild hypoxia, mild starvation, and extreme fatigue across 32 survivors, the Accord's medical team kept encountering something that none of their training had prepared them for. Not a single member of the crew showed the psychological markers associated with group survival guilt, the complicated trauma that emerged when some members of a group survived and others didn't. Because everyone had survived. Together. By choice. The medical officer's report included this line. Human group cohesion under existential threat appears to be categorically different from any previously observed species response. They do not triage their social bonds under sufficient pressure. They appear to renegotiate the conditions of survival before accepting that some bonds must be severed. The psychological health outcomes of the Perseverance crew suggest this approach, while demanding more of individuals, produces superior collective outcomes. We do not yet have a framework to fully explain this. Further study is urgently recommended. The Vornak had survived their death world by being harder than everything around them. The humans had survived theirs by refusing to abandon each other. The difference was small. The implications were vast. Direct hit theme, recognition, respect, and the new order. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Accord had been convened 4,000 times in its 3,000-year history. It had witnessed the admission of 47 species, the resolution of 11 galactic-scale conflicts, the ratification of 200 treaties, and the expulsion of 2 civilizations that had violated foundational Accord principles. It was the most significant political body in the known galaxy, and it met in a chamber large enough to hold delegations from every member species simultaneously, with acoustics engineered to carry every voice equally regardless of physiological differences. It had never held a formal inquiry into the status of a newly admitted species before. It did now. The inquiry had been called by Councillor Drexnavar, former fleet commander, now representing the Vornak bloc in the highest political body in the galaxy, and its stated purpose was, in the careful diplomatic language of the official motion, to formally assess and appropriately categorize the status of humanity within the Galactic Accord, with specific reference to biological classification, military capability standards, and diplomatic representation rights. In less diplomatic language, the Vornak wanted to officially decide what to do about humans. The chamber held 2,000 delegates when the session opened. By Drexnavar's count, every seat was filled. In 6 years of Accord membership, humanity had generated more interest, more data, more heated discussion, and more revised assumptions than any other admission in the Accord's history. The human delegation sat in the section reserved for recently admitted species, 12 people in the neat dark uniforms the ESA had adopted for diplomatic functions, which they had been told looked professional but which several other species found quietly alarming because dark, solid-colored close-fitting garments were, in Accord cultural semiotics, associated with predatory intent. The humans had been informed of this and had responded that they would work on it, but changing the uniforms mid-inquiry felt like the wrong message. Ambassador Chen Wei, still serving, now 68, with the addition of a cane she used as a prop more than a support and reading glasses she had started needing genuinely, sat in the center of the human delegation. She had read every report, every incident summary, every medical analysis, every after-action review that had accumulated around humanity in 6 years of Accord membership. She had a very clear sense of why they were here. Drexnavar rose to speak. Honored delegates, he began, 6 years ago, this Accord admitted humanity on the basis of standard first contact protocols. We applied our usual classification framework. We noted their Class 8 Death World origin and flagged it as significant, but our assessments proceeded from the assumption that the difference between Class 8 and Class 9 was primarily a matter of degree. He paused. We were wrong. The chamber was very quiet. The Accord has accumulated substantial evidence over 6 years, in multiple contexts and locations, that humanity represents a categorically different type of Death World species than anything previously encountered. I will summarize the key findings. He proceeded to lay out, methodically, the accumulated case. The diplomatic engagement on the Dominion. The defense of Thessar Station. The Marith colony survival. The HSF Perseverance. A dozen smaller incidents, Human traders who had talked their way out of piracy situations by being more frightening calm than the pirates were armed. Human researchers who had documented their own life-threatening experiments with an apparent lack of personal concern that had alarmed their collaborators. Human colonists on 4 other difficult worlds who had collectively added infrastructure during crises. The central finding, Drexnavar said, is this: every Deathworld species we have encountered has survived by becoming harder than their environment. More aggressive. More resilient. More capable of absorbing damage. This is the model we have used to understand Deathworld adaptation. It is the model on which Vornak's supremacy in this accord has been predicated. He stopped. Looked across the chamber. Humanity survived their Deathworld differently. They did not become harder than their environment. They became more cohesive. More adaptive. More capable of working together under conditions that destroy social bonds in every other species we have observed. They carry fear and continue. They accept loss as a possibility and refuse it as an outcome. They look at problems that have no good solution and find a third option no one considered. The chamber was so quiet that the ventilation systems were audible. I have been asked, Drexnavar continued, by my bloc to propose formal reclassification of humanity to a protected or restricted status, to limit their growth within the accord out of what my bloc has characterized as prudential concern. He paused. I am not making that proposal today. Murmurs. Significant ones. Instead, I am proposing that humanity be formally recognized as a full accord member with Class A security standing, eligible for all military, diplomatic, and exploratory assignments without restriction. I am further proposing that the Accord's biological classification system be formally updated to distinguish between 2 types of Deathworld adaptation: hardness-based and cohesion-based. And I am proposing that human representatives be included in the Accord Security Council, which has been exclusively Vornak-led since its founding. The murmurs became something considerably louder. Drexnavar waited for it to settle. I make these proposals not because I am not concerned about humanity. I make them because I have spent 6 years paying careful attention to what humans do, and I have concluded that the Accord's greatest asset, and our greatest need, is not more hardness. Every species in this chamber has survived. Humanity has figured out how to make sure everyone survives together. That is not a threat to manage. That is a capability we need. He sat down. Ambassador Chinwei rose. She was shorter than almost everyone in the chamber. She did not use the cane for the walk to the speaker's position. She set it against the podium and looked out at 2,000 delegates, Vornak, Keshmarati, Palurin, Thessari, and 35 others, all watching her with expressions ranging from cautious to fascinated to something she could only classify as hopeful. On behalf of Earth and humanity, she said, we are grateful for Councillor Drexnavar's assessment and his proposals. We would like to accept. She looked around the chamber. We came here 6 years ago not knowing what to expect. We come from a world that is, objectively, extremely difficult to live on, and we brought that difficulty with us. Not as a weapon. As a perspective. She leaned slightly on the podium. Every human alive has grown up on a world that wanted to kill them in approximately 47 different ways, and has learned to live there anyway together because that was the only way it worked. We didn't know other worlds were easier. We didn't know survival was something you could take for granted. It still surprises us, honestly. A small smile. What we can offer the Accord is simple. We don't give up. On problems or on each other. We hope that's useful. The vote was not unanimous. It rarely was in the Accord. But it was decisive. That evening, in a small room off the main diplomatic wing, Drexnavar found Ambassador Chinwei looking out a viewport at the city below. A city of 40 million beings, all species, all living in the complicated peace that the Accord maintained. You knew, he said, when you came up to meet us 6 years ago. You knew we were trying to assess you. Of course, she said. Were you afraid? She smiled. Counselor, I was terrified. My hands were shaking in the shuttle. I've been frightened every day of the past 6 years in ways that don't go away just because you get used to them. Then how? Being frightened doesn't mean you don't show up, she said simply. It just means you're paying attention. She looked at him. You told me once your homeworld was Class 9. 1 step above ours. Yes. You survived it by being harder than it was, she said. We survived ours by taking care of each other. Different strategies. She turned back to the viewport. The galaxy is large, Counselor. There are probably things out there that will require both approaches working together. Drexnavar stood beside her and looked out at the city of 40 million. Probably, he agreed. Below them, the lights of Accord Prime burned against the dark, 48 species, improbably coexisting, improbably surviving, building something that none of them could have built alone. And somewhere in the outer arms of the galaxy, on a small blue world classified as a Class 8 death world, several billion humans were going about their complicated, dangerous, resilient lives, fighting each other, helping each other, failing and trying again, completely unaware that they had just changed the shape of the galaxy. It was, all things considered, a very human way to do it.